Well, I want to talk a little bit about the economic value of inclusion. And of course, the data has been clear for some time now that more diverse and inclusive organizations perform better. McKinsey and others have made that really clear. But what we often don't discuss is why that's true, what's happening in those organizations. It's a complex topic, to be sure, and I'm only going to speak for a few minutes, so a lot of oversimplification will happen, but I ask that you sort of bear with me. Our particular focus at Reimagine Gender, as you might imagine, is gender. And honestly, most companies are really stuck when it comes to issues related to gender. One of the primary reasons is that people just don't really understand what gender is, and new language and concepts are causing confusion for many. After years of companies' commitments to gender equality and spending lots and lots of money to try to accomplish that, the truth is that we just haven't made very much progress. Part of that reason is that typically companies today are talking about gender as a woman's issue or a transgender issue, but in fact, all of us are affected by the ways that gender is constructed, not to the same degree and not in the same ways, but we're all affected, including men. And I'd like to use a story to illustrate how constructions of gender impact the performance of people in our organizations. And while it may not be a day-to-day example that everybody can relate to in their business, the concepts I hope will translate. And it's a story about Wilt Chamberlain. And Wilt Chamberlain, of course, is one of the greatest basketball players of all time. But he had an Achilles heel, and that was he was a horrible free throw shooter. I mean, truly horrible, like statistically, notoriously horrible shooter. And the implications are really significant because what that means is competitors, especially in critical moments, will choose to foul you because they know you're less likely to make the shot from the free throw line. So the cost is significant to the player and teammates and the organization itself, of course. But something happened in 1962 that was really, truly remarkable, and that is that Wilt Chamberlain had a game where he scored 100 points. And that's a record that's never been broken. In fact, it's probably likely it never will be broken. And so what changed that Wilt Chamberlain went from being this horrible free throw shooter to, in that game, he made 28 out of 32 free throws that he attempted. And the difference is that he, at the beginning of that season, had made a change, and he began shooting free throws underhanded, what many of us on the playground when we were kids spoke about as the granny shot. And so you think, okay, this is terrific, right? Wow, he's fixed this fundamental weakness as a player. He's going to be unstoppable, right? In fact, I think his coach made a comment that if you could get near 90% on your free throws, it may be possible we would not even lose a game. But instead of continuing this remarkable change, the next season he actually goes back to shooting free throws the way that he had been shooting. And the same lousy results accompany that change. When asked why he did that, he said, I just felt silly. I felt like a sissy and I just couldn't do it. And, you know, while that might be a story from a number of decades ago about somebody in a very different profession, the same thing is happening in our organizations today. When we're in meetings where we're depending on the creativity and the innovation of the people in our organizations, oftentimes they have a different dialogue happening in their heads, wondering if I say this, will I appear too weak as a man or too aggressive as a woman? Will my saying this maybe bring more visibility and attention to me as a transgender, non-binary employee, when in fact I'd rather have maybe a little less attention. And so these are ways in which we're all silencing ourselves in our organizations, and we're not able to tap the creativity and innovation that our employees bring or could bring and that we're depending on as an organization. Of course, there are other ways too that assumptions and a lack of understanding about gender hurt our organizations. I think the ways that we actively exclude potential customers in how we gender our products is relevant there too. A colleague was telling me a story not long ago about how he really loves this one brand of shoe retailer, and he wanted to get pairs of shoes for his wife and daughters. And so he did, he gets on there and he finds this color and he loves it, he knows they're gonna love it. And then he goes over to the men's section to try to find that same color, and it's not there. And he said, you know, I left the site thinking, what does that mean about my masculinity that I like the color that apparently isn't really a color for men? And I said, well, what it means is that retailer didn't make a sale it otherwise would have made. And I also think that any time that we force our potential customers to have an existential identity crisis, we're definitely doing something wrong. And that's what had happened for him. I remember too, when the Hasbro CEO made a comment that they started changing how they were gendering products when they discovered that 30% of the global market for My Little Pony was boys, even though they explicitly gender that product in the advertising specifically for girls. So boys actually had to overcome that gendering in order to buy the product, and their parents too, of course. We often turn off employees and customers with outdated understandings of gender too. A well-known brand in June as a way to signal its acceptance of LGBTQ folks rolled out a third gender option for their customers. Unfortunately, what they rolled out was male, female, and non-binary. And male and female are identifiers for sex, not for gender. So while their hearts were absolutely, I think, in the right place, and it's a great company, what they signaled was what they didn't understand about gender, not what they do understand about gender. That's also true when we do things like stating that we have a goal of 50-50 in our management ranks, for example, by 2030 or something like that. Increasingly, our employees and our customers don't see gender in a binary. Millennials, for example, statistically, we know that they see gender more as a spectrum than a binary. 12% of millennials identify as transgender or gender nonconforming. And when we talk about Gen Z, this is obviously even much more true. I remember a global study recently that was rolled out, nearly 25% of Gen Zers expect to change their gender identity at least once in their lifetime. I mean, this is just mind-blowing for many of us, right? For in previous generations where we thought of this as a static thing, these are very different understandings of gender. So what are a couple examples of companies that are doing some right things about gender? I think Apple does a fantastic job, for example. They have products without gender distinctions. They have colors, but those colors are not associated with gender. Products are products, colors are colors. You should just buy whatever makes your heart happy, and that's a nice thing. I think Ursa Major is an interesting skincare and body care product company that doesn't distinguish products based on gender. There is no sort of grooming product signaling things for men and beauty products for women. If you want a facial cleanser, they'll tell you all kinds of great things about their facial cleanser, but they're not going to tell you which one is sort of the men's version or the women's version. And so I think that while gender is more complex than all of us were taught, it isn't so complicated that we can't understand it and use that knowledge to create healthier, more successful companies. One thing that we can do, and I think it's the most important thing that we can do, is to educate our organizations about what gender is, about how these understandings of gender are evolving, and why understanding gender is essential to your company's success. It's not just a nice thing to do. It's not just the politically correct thing to do. It is essential to your relevance as a company and to your growth as an organization. It won't take a lot of money, but the impact will be really significant. You'll improve market share. You're going to create a healthier culture in your organization. And hopefully along the way, you'll also create a healthier society where all of us can be our more authentic selves.
Really good. So that was really concrete, and the examples were great. You know, going to the company that used male, female, and non-binary. So what would have been a better way for them to have done that?
Well, I think, you know, instead of male or female, you know, boys, saying boys that were men instead of males, because boy and men is a gender identifier. Girls or women instead of female. Again, those are gender identifiers instead of female, which is a sex identifier. I think non-binary, these are complex things when we get to identities, and many companies are tripping on this. In fact, the most common thing I see is that exact thing. You'll see something that says, you know, here's our gender breakdown, and it will say male and female, or here are your options for gender. And again, it will say that. I think it's a tricky thing, and of course the language is continuing to evolve. So it's not a simple thing, but just because it's not simple doesn't mean it's too complicated for us to figure it out. But that certainly would have been a good starting place for that company.
And reimagine gender, what exactly do you do? Do you go into companies and help them with those sorts of problems, for example?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, my focus really, I come from a marketing background. The nonprofit world is a relatively new thing in a regular capacity as part of my job. But that's exactly what we're trying to do. We go into companies without any judgment, no agenda. It's just, what are you trying to accomplish and how do we try to help you get there? And so the first place really is generally, how do we help you understand what gender is? How do we get you comfortable with the language and the concepts of gender so that you can begin to get a gender lens and see the ways that gender is a part of your company, from product conception all the way through support, right? It really is every aspect of what we're doing. And it matters whether we get it right or we don't get it right. And so just helping companies understand that and helping them be successful in whatever metrics are meaningful to them.
A very interesting macro example of how this really does have real world consequences is this issue of masculinity and the virus. And the people are not wearing masks because, and the president clearly believes that it's not macho, not masculine in order to wear a mask. And that has modeled, and there was a whole article in the New York Times about how false notions that wearing a mask is not masculine has led to more disease.
Absolutely. David, I mean, that's a great example. What's also interesting to me too is that how we're tempted and how organizations are tempted to use sort of similar assumptions about masculinity to turn it on its head. So to say, listen, it's not a sign of weakness, but men are protectors, and so therefore men should wear masks because that's part of their role. Well, that's also using the construction of gender to try to get you to do something that other constructions of gender are getting in the way of. I think that ultimately that might keep you healthier, so that might be a better construction to utilize. But in the same way, we're still using really these outdated notions about what it means to be a man to either get you to do or not do something. And I think it's also going to really affect us when we look at this economic climate going forward. I mean, there's a number of jobs and that will be available that jobs that are going away in other industries may no longer. You may not have as many manufacturing jobs, for example. But what about healthcare? What about ways in which we service? Well, a lot of times those jobs are gendered as feminine. And so nursing is a great example. Nursing it can be a terrific job for men, and yet the way that we've constructed it makes it very difficult. I mean, the burdens to overcome for a man to take that role are actually really significant. So we have to look at the ways that this has real world, I think, impact in our organizations, and also the larger economic reality that we're finding about the ways in which we gender literally everything from colors to our roles and in our family and things like mask wearing and the economic future is dependent on us getting this figured out a whole lot better than what we're doing today.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Really helpful to have you here, and I think it adds to our focus on empathy and inclusion, which we are trying to make a macro theme, one of the themes of this Health and Wealth of America conversation. So thank you again.
Well, thank you, David, and I really, really appreciate being a part of this important event. Thank you.